All right, so welcome back. I hope you are still doing well with this stuff and you have not, chased the subway. Um, all right, so we're starting chapter 4, section 1. This is really going to focus more on segregation and social tensions that are going on between African Americans and a lot of the legislation that happens during this time period. That came out my mouth weird. So why does it matter? So we briefly discussed the impact the Reconstruction era had, and the ultimate goal of the government was to secure equal rights for African Americans. However, the Gilded Age showed that the government and white people were not interested in the expansion of rights for African Americans or other minorities. This time period leaves a lasting impact of politics in the South and creates further divided social classes. A lot of this is going to deal with primarily the South. This is going to be that explicit, visible racism. The North is going to be a little bit different, and it's more based on that implicit bias or the ones that we don't see. And we'll talk about that the further we get into the, U.S. history, especially when we get around to the Civil Rights Movement. So, African Americans lose their freedom. So we're going to talk about the wonderful Rutherford B. Hayes. And he essentially signals the end of federal enforcement of Amendments 13 through 15 as he removed the troops from the South. This allows the South to reassert their dominance over African American populations with Jim Crow laws. And they did this without fear of intervention. Essentially, what Rutherford B. Hayes does is when he removes the troops from the South, it's like sticking a room full of children, sticking a bunch of children in a room without parental supervision. Although we like to assume kids will naturally always do the right thing, that is not necessarily the case. For instance, if I left you all alone for lunch, you would all get around and roam around your classroom like a bunch of heathens, right? Possible. So that's the same concept, is when Rutherford B. Hayes basically pulls the troops out of the South becomes the children that they are and fall back and revert to old patterns. And although it is illegal to explicitly keep someone from being able to vote or participate in their, rights as a citizen of the United States, there are ways to get around it, and especially if there's no one there to make sure it doesn't happen. So states begin violating the 15th Amendment, which focuses on prohibiting states from limiting the right to vote based on race, color, and previous conditions of servitude. And a lot of these ways are going to come based on stripping. They're going to be focusing on things that African Americans don't have access to. But not explicitly is it only African Americans that don't have access to these things. The South began stripping the recently freed African Americans of their most basic right without actually saying they cannot vote. There are multiple ways the South limited the freedom of African Americans, and these are the three most popular were literacy tests, poll taxes, or the grandfather clause. And I think we have briefly discussed this, but we're going to actually talk about it as like a chapter. Now, if you remember last chapter, we talked about blackface and its role in minstrel shows and the vaudevilles, right? So this right here is where the idea of blackface comes from. This is the original Jim Crow. This is the photo painted of the stereotypical African American that lives in the South. And this racist image is going to be perpetuated so far deep in Southern culture that it becomes a standard. The stereotype sets itself so deeply that nobody believes that African Americans actually truly have the intelligence level to vote. But we'll find out why, actually. So each focuses on something that African Americans did not have access to, thus inhibiting them from being able to vote. So let's talk about the first one. A poll tax is a fee that people must pay in order to vote, usually $1 or $2, or the equivalent of about $54 today. This is a lot to a population that was recently freed and did not have steady income at the time. If you could not pay the tax, you could not vote. Okay? So, the most common one is going to be the written test, okay? A literacy test. And all literacy tests do is determine your ability to read or write. And the voter must take and pass in order to vote. Most white people did not have to take the tests because they were white. However, occasionally they would push this onto poor white people who they knew would not vote in favor of their particular goal. Okay? Here's why they couldn't pass. You never taught your slaves to read. So if you never taught your slaves to read, they certainly do not know how to read now after being recently freed. So they could not pass the test, restricting them from voting. The next was the tests were impossible. It usually didn't matter if you couldn't read, because the content was too difficult. So for instance, let's take the near impossible literacy test Louisiana used to suppress the black vote. This is in 1964, so this is going to continue for a very long time. It does not stop. Draw a line around a number or letter of this sentence. Draw a line under the last word in this line. Cross out the longest word in this line. Draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. In the spaces below, draw 3 circles, one inside, engulfed by the other. Above the letter X, make a small cross. Draw a line through the letter below that comes earliest in the alphabet. Draw a line through 2 letters below that come last in the alphabet. In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with the letter L. Cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. In the line below, cross out each number that is more than 20 but less than 30. Now, some of that seems simple, right? We're going to keep going. Draw a line under the first letter after H and draw a line through the second letter after J. In the space below, write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forward. Draw a triangle with a blackened circle that overlaps only its left corner. Look at the line of numbers below and place on the blank the number that should come next. Look at the line of numbers below and place on the blank the number that should come next. Draw in a space below a square with a triangle in it, and within that same triangle draw a circle with a black dot in it. Spell backwards forwards. Print the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. Place a cross over the 10th letter in this line, a line under the first space in this sentence, and a circle around the last "the" in the second line of this sentence. Draw a figure that is square in shape, divided by half by drawing a straight line from its northeast corner to its southwest corner. Then divide it once more by drawing a broken line from the middle of its western side to the middle of its eastern side. This goes on, I think, for a while. Hold on. Nope, it's done after this one. Last page. Print a word that looks the same whether it is printed forwards or backwards. Write down on the line provided what you read in the triangle below. Paris in the spring. In the third square below, write a second letter of the fourth word. Write from the left to the right as you see it spelled here. Divide a vertical line into 2 equal parts by bisecting it with the curved horizontal line that is only straight as its spot, and at its spot bisection of the vertical. Write every other word in this first line and print every third word in the same line. Original type smaller and first line ended in a comma, but capitalize the 5th word that you write. Draw 5 circles that one common interlocking part. As you can see, that is meant to be almost impossible. Even I got confused in some certain parts. And this is why people wouldn't pass, and they would not be able to vote. Lastly, the grandfather clause, which stated that only those who had a grandfather that voted prior to 1866 could vote in the elections. Considering that most African Americans were recently freed, it is highly unlikely they would have had a grandfather vote. This is essentially only allowed white males to vote in the South. With these practices, it essentially removes the African American vote in the South. that allows for racist legislature to be passed, only furthering the violation of the 13th and 15th Amendment. If no one's there to stop it, it's only going to keep getting worse, correct? And that is what happened when Rutherford B. Hayes does this, when he pulls out the federal troops enforcing. So with the 19th century coming to a close, Jim Crow had completely changed the South. So what is a Jim Crow law? Jim Crow laws are complete separation of African Americans from whites with the use of legal, state, and local legislation. The federal government will never have a national law that specifically focuses on the separation and segregation of African Americans. Okay, that is only going to be on a state and local level. Everything in the South was segregated, from beaches to restaurants to waiting rooms, bathrooms, hospitals, even drinking fountains. This type of segregation was limited to the South, but the North, there was something called de facto segregation. We will get into that. But this sign was often visible, or no coloreds, or coloreds eat in the back, colored restroom only, colored water fountain. Water fountain. Wow, that was a hard word. We don't use the word color today because it was not used in a very respectful form or term to, like, back then. If someone called you colored, it was not a compliment, it was an insult. So we don't use that word today. So what is de facto segregation? It's racial, ethnic, or other segregation resulting from societal differences between groups or socioeconomic or political disparity, without institutionalized legislation intended to segregate. For instance, the North practiced de facto segregation by usually limiting the jobs or places they could live in. This was odd considering legislation in place that outlawed segregation in the North. What is a very common one is something called a sundown town. A sundown town is a town that African Americans were allowed to shop, participate, and be in. But when the sun went down, they had to leave. They could not live there, and they could not shop there after dark. It wasn't necessarily a national law, but it was a local law. And it was something often practiced in rural parts of the Midwest, and I would say maybe really, really rural parts of the North. But they also made it harder for them to get loans to buy new houses and participate in business things. So there were ways that they limited the access to money, political positions, and other things without legally doing it in the North. So in the 1870s, the Supreme Court ruled segregation was legal. In 1896, after the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of Jim Crow laws. They stated that it was constitutional, arguing that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment. In reality, not a single thing was equal and did violate the 14th Amendment. Think about it this way. If I thought you were inferior from me and I didn't want you sharing my things, I probably am not giving you the same access to the things that I have. For instance, you probably don't have as nice as school books as me. Or maybe you don't have access to as nice of, sort of like public transportation, or your bathrooms probably don't look as nice as mine. Nothing was equal, and it did violate the 14th Amendment, every single one of them. So let's say you were brave enough to be like, you know what? Screw that. I'm going to do what I want, when I want, and how I want, because I am a strong, independent woman. Well, these violate the laws to violate these laws was essentially sign your own death certificate, and I'm not being dramatic. Meaning it was extremely, extremely, extremely dangerous to go against these laws. If you were caught or found to be guilty of violating these laws, you were often beaten, mutilated, and burned or hanged at the result of this. Something that becomes very common is something called lynching. We're going to talk about that. But that's what is happening in this photo and this photo. So, although Jim Crow laws were in full effect, African Americans refused to be treated as second-class citizens. They created their own newspapers, colleges, clubs, and so on. And we've talked about this is where HBCUs come from and why they exist. They exist because of Jim Crow. The most famous African-American writer, the most famous African-American rights activist during the late 19th century was Booker T. Washington. He had a very non-traditional way of looking at segregation. Booker felt that blacks should accept segregation. He believed that blacks should not focus on overturning Jim Crow laws, but to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and create resources and change the public opinion to believe in the black population. What he means by that is find any means you can to educate yourself, market yourself, make yourself irreplaceable. And eventually the whites will see that, hey, the blacks aren't less than us, or, you know, they don't need to be segregated from us. They are one of us. Booker was a former slave who became one of the most educated African Americans of his time. He poured his heart and soul in creating a school named the Tuskegee Institute, which provided industrial education. We will hear that word again in and during World War II. His goal was to better educate the population. His goal was a better educated population would result in a greater respect and an acceptance into full citizenship. This is not a very widely received or well-received idea. And that is because of a man by W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, Washington's suggest solution to segregation was not well received, especially by another well-known activist, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois believed that Booker T was far too accommodating to the white racists of the South, allowing segregation to continue. If you find ways to justify that white people can continue this, they're going to. And if you say that I need to prove that I'm worth something to a bunch of racist people, it's not going to work. They're never going to justify what you're doing. They're never going to understand. That's his idea behind it. Okay? Du Bois did not believe in gradually earning equality and that blacks should demand equal rights instantly and not limit themselves to vocational education or industrial education. Du Bois was a Harvard graduate who believed that every African American should focus on becoming educated in the highest forms and not stopping at vocational education. If you can get a college degree, go get one. If you can graduate from high school, do that. And if while you're doing that, you can also learn a skill, go do that. But I'd prefer if you went to college. They're very, very, very different. So looking at W.E.B. Du Bois, believed in voting is not a privilege someone should earn, but be given. All African Americans should receive college educations was popular amongst most African Americans, but was not well received by the whites. Versus Booker T. Washington. Thought that change wasn't going to happen overnight. Gradual introduction to change was the best idea, and vocational school made blacks useful and needed. Popular amongst whites, but not so much against blacks. And if you think about that, W.E.B. Du Bois challenges a lot of white thoughts, but supports a lot of what African Americans want. Booker T. Washington doesn't challenge the whites as much, but he does not push for all the equal rights that blacks want. Another very important person that's going to emerge out of this time is Ida B. Wells. She speaks out of something called lynching. It was a popular method of both punishment and entertainment for Southerners. She becomes a popular, prominent figure speaking out against lynching and injustices towards African Americans during the late 1800s. Her father became a very big businessman in Mississippi, which is hard. This is the Deep South. But he encourages her to educate herself and speak out, and that woman does, and she does it with gusto. But first, what is a lynching? A lynching is a mob killing of a person suspected, and I say suspected of a crime because usually they have not been convicted nor tried. They were just arrested. And especially, these were not normally done within the law. Usually what it looked like is, let's say that someone in our community was arrested for some type of violation of a Jim Crow law. Okay? So what that means is, sorry. What that means is, you commit that crime, I arrest you as the sheriff or whatever. And you know me, and that person that just got arrested was someone who violated your sister, brother, mom, dad, child, it doesn't matter, right? And so you come up to me and you're like, hey, can I have a key? And I'm like, no, but I'm going to set my keys down and go get a cup of coffee. If you were to happen to grab these, I would not notice, and then I would walk away, okay? This was pretty standard, and they were never taken calmly, obviously. So right here are two African American males who were hung for two different reasons. They were actually not guilty at all, which was a pretty good standard. Not pretty good standard. It's just it was pretty standard, okay? Now the part of this that is mildly weird. Not weird. Both offensive, weird, peculiar, everything about it. A lot of these people are dressed in their Sunday best. They're dressed up for this event. That woman's got a whole fur collar on. And they are smiling. They're having a good time. These two are on a date. And this man, this intense looking man with this little tattoo, I think, on his arm is what it looks like. It might not be. It looks like one, though. He's pointing at them. Like, this will happen to you if you don't stop, if you don't listen. If you don't follow the rules of the South, you too will be next. Here's another one. This was very common. Okay. This is very serious, and I want you to look around and see another set of people dressed in their Sunday best. And would you look at that? There's children, right? Again, here's another one, a little less visual, but you look around and there's a bunch of men, some smiling with one tooth, some not smiling at all. But most importantly, we see is there's children, and children are highly impressionable. And they learn this from their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, uncles, grandpas, so on and so forth. So Ida B. Wells is aware of what's happening, and she becomes a newspaper owner in Memphis, Tennessee. The paper's name is Free Speech. Its goal was to spread the stories of people of color and point out injustices. While living in Memphis, one of her friends becomes a victim of a lynching. And this sparks Ida B. Wells. From that point on, she makes it her job to combat the heinous crime of lynching and publicizing how it goes unnoticed. Nobody in the North really knows a lot of this is going on. In fact, nobody's really reporting it at all. Governments are not investigating these lynchings in the South. The FBI isn't coming. I'm not even sure the FBI exists. There's no Federal Bureau of Investigations that's coming to look into this. No one knows what's going on, and her open criticism gets her ran out of Memphis. But Wells never quits her lifelong crusade against lynching. She will continue this even after she is kicked out of the place she is writing about. Women were often large proponents of equal rights for African Americans, largely because they realized that with the people of color vote, they would likely gain their suffrage in the process. So it is mildly a selfish thing they are doing. However, women pushed the hardest for the equal rights of African Americans during the Civil War. The post-Civil War, women began women began pushing the boundaries of societal norms for themselves. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, which read like the Declaration of Independence. It essentially pointed out, like, when it comes in the course of which men must demand, or something like that, but just referred to as women. It was written to point out the injustices against women and people of color, just as the colonists wrote it to England for the injustices against them. Susan B. Anthony and others were angry that women were excluded from the 14th Amendment, beginning the movement for women's suffrage in 1869. Suffrage does not mean they have suffered. Suffrage is the right to vote. I know some of you are thinking, assuming, why are they suffering? They are not. They are just trying to get their votes. They are suffering, but the word suffrage does not mean suffering. Unfortunately, women's suffrage would not gain much ground during the late 19th century. Anthony and Stanton's speeches would resonate with the West, granting the right to vote in 4 Western states. Women did, however, make some small advances. By increasing the amount of college-graduated women and becoming important in reform, women spearheaded the temperance movement. What is the temperance movement? Not a well-received thing. Where is the rest of my slideshow? Well, it is gone, so if there is more to the notes that are not there, I apologize. We stop there. I don't know where the rest of it went. Okay, great. That is the end.